Guys, welcome back to LS Vintage Design. I'm Lisa. How's everybody doing today? Today we are talking all about vintage crafts that are still around today, and some of them you can even get the vintage craft itself if you can find it. So why don't we just jump into this video because it's an excellent one. Today we're going to talk about 3 specific crafts that are still around, and one that if you're lucky you might be able to find, but mostly what you find of it is the product that was created and not the supplies to do it. So let's talk about the 3 that you can still sort of find today. The first one is paint by numbers. They started a long time ago. They're still around today. But if you go on Etsy, you can find vintage paint by number kits. Now, most of these come with disclaimers. Obviously, these people, if they're unopened, don't know if the paint's still good. And that's what you would want to buy. That way you make sure at least that if you get an unopened sealed paint by number, you're getting the paint, the paintbrush, and the either 8x10, 9x12, whatever size item in there that you're going to paint. And most of them came with 2 items. You can find ones that obviously have been opened, that parts are missing, that if you just want the box or the instructions, you can find those. But what's the fun in that, right? They are kind of pricey. So if you're going to buy one, they're going to be more to sit out in your space so you can admire it and others can admire it. And maybe if you want to do a paint by number, get a modern kit because, you don't want to pay $60 for a paint by number. And that's just one of the prices. And I'm not knocking the prices at all, believe me. That's about what I would charge. I'm going to show you some on Etsy in a little bit. But before I do that, I wanted to go ahead and talk about a few more vintage crafts that are still around today. And the next one is knitting. Now, a lot of times, if you go to estate sales, you can find really old yarn and knitting needles that maybe the owner had for 30 years. I don't see very many old vintage knitting needles. You might find a few. So if you want to try vintage knitting, all it is old needles and old yarn. Better off just, looking for a vintage needle book and then making whatever you're knitting from new needles and new yarn. The third one is stamped embroidery. And these you can still find on Etsy or at an estate sale, sometimes a thrift store. I actually found a whole stack of these at an estate sale. And one sewing kit, one vintage put the pillows together. It was cute. So I will leave, so you can find these. I'm actually about to list a couple of these. I got a whole stack. I'm not going to make them, obviously. So I do want to share them with people maybe that collect vintage sewing items or like vintage embroidery and would do it. Or maybe, like I said, you just want to add it to your collection. Or maybe you're getting it for somebody that loves to do it. So I will be listing a few. I'm not quite sure which ones. I'm going to keep one. I have made sure it comes with the directions, the yarn, and the what you're going to embroidery on. It is discolored, so read the full listing on my Etsy shop. Like I said, you can find these, but a lot of times they are going to be discolored. They weren't meant to be used. This one is from the 70s, so if you say 75, 78, somewhere in there, I mean, that's 30, 40 years, 50 years almost. That's 50 years if it was 74 this year. So this, they weren't meant to be saved and used 50 years later. So you do have some discoloration. It doesn't have a year on here. I'm just guessing. But it is from the 70s. I know that. And this is called Crewel. Crewel. C-R-E-W-E-L. I call it embroidery, but honestly it's not. Well, it's a crewel embroidery kit. because it doesn't have the little thin threads that you use for embroidery. It has thick yarn that you pull apart. So this is a crewel embroidery kit. It's from the 70s. And it's discolored, but you know what? Doesn't matter. I'm going to list them. And then last is pebble art. Now, pebble art is actually this. This is the result of the pebble craft that was popular in the 50s. And I, at one time in an antique store, found a box of the pebbles used to make some of these. Not these particular ones. These are mine. But very rarely do you find the pebbles anymore. I imagine this was a craft that homemakers' wives did back in the 50s. They would, create their image, and then they would throw the extras away or use them in their next image. So not a lot of that survived. I guess this was from somebody's own family. They found it in their stuff, and I do have it. It's up in the top of my closet, and I didn't feel like climbing up and getting it. But this is the result of the pebble art. It's very, very popular. It's MCM art now. And to think it started out as a craft that a homemaker did back in the 50s. That just blows my mind. I have several of these. I love them. There's several on Etsy. Again, they are very expensive. You can find these, though. They're pretty plentiful in antique malls and on Etsy. But you can't find the supplies anymore to create that. But how cool would that be? Like, I have mine, and if I wanted to make something, I could print an image off the internet and do the pebble art on it. Or I could draw something being an artist. I just think it's very cool. That's the one we're talking about that's not around anymore. The other three, there are modern equivalents, but you can still find, like I said, all the supplies pretty much for the other ones. So come on in and I'll show you a couple of the vintage paint by numbers on Etsy. I'll show you if there's any of the vintage creative needlecraft kits. This is actually Avon, by the way. So I'll see if there's any on Etsy as well and show you those too. So come on in and I'll just show you a few examples that you can find. But like I said, if you really want to do a paint by number, I would buy one fresh from the store unless you're a collector of vintage crafts. And then, of course, if you are a collector of vintage crafts, or maybe you want to start collecting or start somebody on a collection journey, Craftmaster is the vintage brand that all the craft kits were made through at the time. So let me pull up these and then we're going to see. Okay, we'll start with, I did find the Avon Vintage Crewel Needlecraft Kits. This one is like the ones I have in the plastic, fully ready to go. It's all there. They say it's from 1973. So I'm going to flip it around so you can see, and you'll get an idea of what you're looking at. And then we'll talk about the paint by number. I'm not making any recommendation towards this seller or any other seller I show you. I do not know these people. But here's an example. This is some pheasant. It looks like they have quite a few pictures up here. You can see there's everything in here. Tells you what's in there. So it's a good little example of the Avon Crewel kits. So you can find these. There were some other brands as well if you wanted to see those. This is a vintage one. This is actually a vintage plastic canvas needlepoint kit. This one looks like it makes a little purse. That's cute. It's not Avon, but it's along the same lines. Vintage needlepoint. This one is, let's see here. Doesn't say much about this one. And of course, the biggest name brand in anything embroidery is Buscella. And there's a lot of vintage on here. This is from the 70s, 80s. Now let's talk about the vintage paint by number. And this is the Craftmaster kit, just one of several you can find. This is some ducks. It says it is 2 8x10 paint by number pictures in oil. Says it's new, sealed, but they are unsure if paint is usable because this is from the 70s, guys. And again, these weren't meant to sit around and do 50 years later. Here's another cute one. This is a kitten one. This is oil paint. Again, it is sealed, 2 9x12 panels, 15 oil colors, 1 artist paintbrush. This one is $40. It's from the 60s, so again, it's 60 years old versus 50 from the 70s. So, you know, you just don't know if these are still good. The ducks are $29. The kittens are $40. If you search up here, vintage paint by number kits. And be sure and put vintage because some people create their own. Hold on. You might get a homemade vintage kit, but look, here's the Craftmaster. You can also find art that was done with a paint by number kit that's vintage. Here's one that has 4. It's $90, 4 seasons. This one is, like I said, I don't know any of these sellers, so, you know, you do your own due diligence. This one, I don't see how old it is. Oh, from the 60s. 4 seasons. So there again, you know, when you buy any vintage craft that contains things that can spoil, like paint that can dry up over time, that does dry up. I've had paint from 5 years that dried up. So, you know, paint from 50, 60 years ago could definitely dry up. So if you buy one of these kits again, just buy it to enjoy, you know, as a vintage item and not something that you actually want to do, because I promise if you really want to do a paint by number, there's a lot of great options that are way cheaper than $30. And honestly, if you search vintage knitting, you're going to get vintage knitted clothes. You're not actually going to get a vintage knitting kit on Etsy. Again, your best bet, if maybe you have somebody or you yourself collect vintage knitting needles, is to search estate sales and thrift stores. So guys, I hope you like this video. It's just a little sampler of what crafts were done, you know, 40, 50, 60 years ago, and what's still around that you could do today. Even if you can't do an actual one from, you know, 40 or 50, 60 years ago, you can do a modern version of the paint by number. You could do a vintage needlecraft kit. There's some on Etsy. I'm going to list some. Or you could get modern kits as well. Again, like I said, the Bucilla, the Bucilla brand has been around for 100 years, I think. And there are plenty of options, both new and vintage online. This is an Avon one, which I think kind of makes it more fun because Avon was so big and popular in the 70s. But, you know, up to you or whoever you're buying it for. More of what they prefer. Again, all that cool 70s knitted Afghan I had, all of that. Let's celebrate. Check it out. Also, if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button and that little bell, because guess what? On Friday, we are doing Cooking Vintage, our second season, with improvements, guys. We learned a lot about trying to film a cooking show. And we're going to do better for you, I promise. So come back for that on Friday. That subscribe button and that little bell. Let's grow our vintage channel, guys. because I have a lot of stuff to share with you. Also, don't forget, check out our website. Lots of great stuff over there as well. Take care. Bye-bye.